Thanks for being. We'll start the meeting, eh?
Thanks, Lloyd.
Kia ora koutou, ngā mihi nui.
Microphone.
Oh, gosh.
Sorry, there was hand signals over there translating it.
All right, ngā mihi nui kia koutou ki te hui mai nei. I'm welcome here today, and I'll just start with karakia. Whakarongo ki au, ki te tangi atu manu nei, ati mātui, tui karonga, tui kararu, tui kawaho, tui roto, tui ki te haere tangata, korango te pō, korango te ao, tui ki te muka tangata. He tai mai, he waiki nui, he waiki roa, he waiki Panama, ki te hono, he waroa, ki te whaio, ki te ao maranga. Hui thank you, and welcome to this adjourned meeting of the Environment Policy Workshop regarding the Clause 3 feedback. This meeting is public and being taped for later on. So welcome everybody. Pretty much the same as last time when we started the meeting last week. We're just talking today about the feedback on the Clause 3 feedback only. Just to hear the feedback and get an understanding about how that feedback's being considered. There has been some areas of the staff being seeking direction. I'm not so sure today, but it's really open for discussion. We want to have free and open discussion around the remaining part of this agenda. So I think the best idea is just we kick it off, and we'll be following the same procedure as last time. And so just welcome Phil and Felicity, along with Anita and Tom at the top of the table, will run us through. But Kate has a question, so we'll start.
No, I don't have a question. I want to make a statement. And I think it's unfair that boycott of Gary Giller hasn't been noted at the start of this meeting. But he was very clear about that. I will not be sitting in on this meeting. Things have changed since last week. We have been given an RPS, which has been enlightening. And we can't talk about it, which makes it really difficult. But I find it contemptuous a contempt process to be carrying on with the land and water plan stage 3 consultation in light of that RPS and the decisions we have to make this afternoon. And the fact that some decisions have been preempted by emails that I think expose us to judicial review. I'm sorry, I can't sit through this any longer and believe that this is a fair and equitable process. That things haven't been prejudged, because I think we're exposed in the process, and so I'm not going to sit through another meeting which isn't a good process. The timing is wrong. The RPS has now been delivered to us. We have got time to read it, and those who have read it, I think, should be concerned about carrying on today as if nothing else has changed. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate. And I will note that Councillor Lawson's leaving the chambers. Andrew?
Look, I've got some sympathy for Kate. I think now that we know what we know about the RPS, it shouldn't be business as usual today. I'm not going to leave the chamber, but I think there's a clear signal in the RPS that the land and water plan has been developed under the same fundamental concept. And I'll just stress the point, but it shouldn't be business as usual today. Like you said, Lloyd, in your introduction, we just keep doing what we started with Clause 3. I think now that we are informed about the RPS, without saying any more than that, I think we just need to rethink about our next steps. But I'm not leaving the chamber.
Thank you, Andrew. Just while we're here, we'd just like to note for the minutes also that Councillor Laws has an apology for this meeting. Councillor Malcolm.
Yeah, just also under the RMA, you can't unknow what you know, and we do now know what the RPS is, although we cannot discuss it, and that will be in a meeting this afternoon, which I will be, and I'll just signal this now, that I'll be asking for that to be publicly included. But I'd also want you, sir, to note the reason that Councillor Wilson has left, not just note that she has left. I would request that the reason be noted in the paper, because when we do go under judicial review for having this meeting, it will need to be very clear that that was her stance.
Thank you, councillor Malcolm.
So just in terms of the process, so it's just a workshop, so there's no official minutes, but it is recorded, so there will be a public record of Councillor Wilson's reasons that'll be available in terms if it's looked into in the future, councillor. So that's definitely will definitely be a record there of councillors' case reasons for leaving this meeting, but there's no formal minutes taken as such for a workshop.
Thank you, councillor Scott.
Thank you. Well, you know, a number of councillors made particular points, and I'd just like to respond as one councillor to those points. We've started a process to hear the clause 3 consultation feedback, and I suspect we've completed 70% of it, but we've got a bit to finish, and I think it's appropriate to finish that. Goes without saying that, you know, there will be discussions on the RPS today, and as Kevin has said, you know, we can't not know what we know, and we'll have an opportunity to discuss the RPS and its implications. And then later today, we'll be having a debate in terms of how the land and water plan fits with the RPS. To me, that's all reasonable and proper process, and I would in fact suggest that, you know, there's a bit of grandstanding going on here. It's not always easy to get things perfect.
Point of order. Point of order.
I don't know if we can have points of order.
Well, if it's a workshop, if you want to say grandstanding, Brian, I think that's very unfair. A particular councillor's made a particular point that is based on a huge amount of experience as a commissioner, as a councillor, as a representative of the people of Otago.
Yeah.
To say that is grandstand is exceptionally unfair. We could.
Thank you. You made your point, Brian. Can you just calm your language down, please, and have respect for all councillors within the chamber?
Certainly, I've said what I need to say. Thank you.
Any other discussion? Okay, so we're Councillor Wilson has made a point. It's been recorded, so it's going to be there for the record. We also like to thank Councillor Noon for making his points as well. Brian has responded, and we're at the stage now that we're at the position now whereby this afternoon's meeting is this afternoon's meeting. This morning's workshop is about going through clause 3 feedback, and what may or may not happen this afternoon may or may not affect how the feedback is approached. All the feedback, not just the feedback we're discussing today. So I think we're probably best to so thank you for clearing the air for us at the beginning, and I think we can look forward to having robust and respectful discussions as we go through the remaining
Brian says something.
part of clause 3.
Sorry. Don't think we caught that, but I think Kevin might be leaving.
Oh, sorry, and we acknowledge that Kevin also put a similar point forward across with Andrew regarding the RPS.
Too late, Lloyd. Your decision's made. I'll just go and wait for the right parts.
Okay, so just a note.
Yeah, it's been recorded.
Councillor Malcolm's left the chamber. Okay, so we'll just proceed. We'll hand over to Anita.
Thank you. So, and I won't speak much. I'll leave it to Tom and Felicity, but this is just a continuation of the workshop from last week, just to discuss the clause 3 feedback. So we've only got a few topics left to cover, and happy to take feedback on that, but I'll just pass over to Felicity and Tom.
Morena, thank you for giving us some more time and the opportunity to kind of run those remaining topics past you. Like you said at the start, what we'll do is we'll give an overview of the key messages, and we'll bring it to your attention where we need some further input or where we are proposing a more substantial kind of change as well. The topics that we have left to cover are hydroelectricity generation and renewable energy generation, and Felicity will cover that off. After that, we'll move on to environmental flows and levels, and that will be about the framework for managing water quantity, as well as we'll cover off a few specific catchments where we had substantial feedback on that. That will be covered off by Jackie Todd, who's online, and Sam Walton. After that, we've got Danny, and Tim will talk to that. And then I will take you through some comments that have been made by various parties with respect to the provisions of the FMU chapters as well. So that's what's installed for the next hour and a half. But I might hand over to Felicity now.
So I'm going to take you through the hydroelectricity generation feedback. As you'd expect, there was strong engagement from the renewable energy generation companies in particular. The plan has some objectives and policies specifically about renewable electricity generation that give effect to the national policy statement on renewables. And there was general support from most parties for the plan's approach and the objectives and policies for renewables. There were some more specific comments throughout the plan. In particular, there was a request for a straightforward consenting pathway for the ongoing maintenance required for the nationally and regionally significant schemes in Otago. Those parties, maintaining those structures in the way that they operate is necessary for their safe operation. And so the parties considered that it would be appropriate to have a clear pathway for consenting those activities in a straightforward way. Some parties considered it was unclear which provisions applied to renewable electricity generation, and this was particularly in the environmental flows and levels chapter, where hydro takes were considered as a non-consumptive take, given that they don't generally take the water out of the bed. But some of the parties didn't appreciate that hydro was included in the non-consumptive pathway that was set up in the rules. So there's just a little bit of work that we need to do to clarify how those activities are provided for in the plan, but there is a pathway for hydro takes. Some parties, there was also some feedback on how some provisions could be amended to better provide for small scale hydro schemes, and most of that was quite technical minor feedback about the wording of particular conditions of rules, which staff are working through at the moment. So on the whole, the approach in the plan isn't changing significantly, but we appreciate that there are a range of minor and technical amendments to improve clarity and I guess the practical application of some of the provisions. So the only thing that we're really seeking direction on is the only major change, I guess, is that we do recommend including a new controlled activity rule for maintenance works on those nationally and regionally significant schemes. That would exclude the taking and use and damming aspect of their operations, which is tends to be the big significant part. This would just be a controlled activity pathway for their maintenance works. And again, that just reflects the scale of the operations.
Do you have any questions, Elliot and Andrew?
Just wondered if you had any details on what those maintenance works involved.
Yeah, so it's maintenance of the actual physical structures in the water bodies themselves. There can be sediment removal from behind the dams, things like that.
Thanks. Andrew?
We sought some feedback from this is in public, isn't it? An independent consultant with regards to small hydro electricity generation. And I assume that's your reference to technical aspects of consenting pathway. Was there any thought given to a controlled activity status, for example, for that type of activity?
For the damming.
And the reason why I ask is that there's a bit of history associated with small hydro, and I think if you talk to the right people who are involved in planning for these types of activities, I don't think there's been a small hydro scheme approved through a planning process in the South Island for a long period of time. Don't quote me, but that's my understanding. So when I say there's a little bit of history, we did communicate with the number of government ministers during the last term, and it seemed to be relatively clear that the national policy statement wasn't the hurdle. It seemed to be our local planning rules. So that's why I'm trying to raise it here and now. And I'm not suggesting that we take an approach that is a Wild West approach. I'm suggesting that we have an approach that provides some sort of certainty around being able to achieve small generation, electricity generation, hydro. And when we as a country are aiming for zero carbon by 2050, it just seems illogical not to have a planning process that A, respects all the environmental laws of the land, but B, provides a pathway to be able to achieve these sorts of activities. So that's what I don't want to lose this opportunity. And it's not about me, but this is about, I think, a principle where our plans have been lacking to a certain extent. But I'll leave it as that.
I'll try to answer that one. So we did an independent review, and the independent review basically pointed at two hurdles. One is the hurdle around processing those consents, and sometimes there's an opportunity to kind of be more clear about what certain terms mean and how they apply. And so that's one hurdle that we're trying to tackle. The other hurdle is around how some of the direction in our plan and water plan. Two major ones are around allocation and around in-stream damming. We're kind of constrained by the national direction, by the NPSs, in terms of what we can do. The NPS renewable energy generation tries to promote renewable energy generation, but it's also clear in the preamble, it kind of says when it comes to allocation, the NPS freshwater management and framework that sits under that has priority over NPS renewable energy generation. So if a new hydro is non-consumptive, it shouldn't be a problem. But if it doesn't meet that threshold, then we need to look at the allocation and the catchment, and we need to stay within the allocation limit. The other one is around in-stream damming. In the NPSFM, we've got some very clear policies that say we need to avoid any loss of river extent and river values. And if you put an in-stream dam, then that is often the case. So we're kind of constrained in what we're trying, in what we can achieve in terms of enabling that kind of an activity. So a controlled activity would be hard to fit in. In certain cases, we might need to decline. But the team is definitely working on enabling small-scale hydro when those two conditions can be met. Like one, there is available allocation or it's non-consumptive, and two, the thresholds for in-stream damming can be met, or it can be provided through an off-stream reservoir.
So Is it fair to summarise to suggest that it's slightly more than just some
Yes,
possible technical tweaks?
Yeah, and I think just picking up the point about the in-stream values and river extent, the NPSFM requires activities that are affecting a river's extent or value to apply the effects management hierarchy, which steps you through the way that you have to manage effects. And the last step is that if you can't compensate for the residual adverse effects, then the activity is avoided, which is a problem for a controlled activity where you don't have the opportunity to decline. But we are definitely looking at ways that you can provide for those small scale schemes in a way that still gives effect to the NPS.
Sorry, this is not going to be a question, Lloyd, but
That's fine.
I think if you look at a target situation and our resilience in particular, if you look throughout our peer network, it's not always, no criticism of anybody, but it's not always that reliable simply because of the terrain, the climate and all the rest of it. So I think this is such an important issue for us. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. Good. Anybody else? Thank you, so we can carry on. Oh,
Yeah, this might be a silly question, but just in terms of other renewable energy generation, solar and wind, what sort of feedback do we get, if any?
that was outside the scope of the brief that we gave to the independent reviewer, and also we didn't get any comments on that.
No, there wasn't much commentary that I can recall from any party on solar and wind.
You had a submission from Meridian, was that right? But
Yes.
it didn't include any.
It was primarily focused on the hydro aspect, yeah.
good, thank you. We'll carry on to the next one.
The next topic is environmental flows and levels, and that will be covered up by Jackie, who's online. And when it comes to specific catchments, Sam will cover that off.
Thanks, Tom. Can you hear us okay? Yep. Yeah, so I'll start talking about some of the region-wide provisions before handing over to Sam. So starting with over-allocation, most parties were generally supportive of the approach to over-allocation. Some parties did request that the rules are a bit stricter in over-allocated catchments in terms of using pathways and timeframes to phase out over-allocation, but then conversely other parties requested more time to phase out over-allocation in certain catchments. Minimum flows and take limits are a big part of this chapter, and so we did receive quite a bit of feedback. Just a reminder that minimum flows and take limits are set in different ways in different catchments, largely depending on how much information is available and how much water is taken from the catchment. In some catchments where there's not much information at the moment, take limits are based on consented allocation as an interim measure until a bespoke limit can be set, and some parties oppose that method. In other catchments where water use isn't high, technical advice was that default take limits could apply and would be appropriate, and some parties oppose those default take limits, either because they're too conservative or because they're not effects-based. The plan sets some minimum flows for some rivers and streams in Otago, but it also provides the ability to set alternative minimum flows in some situations, and site-specific flows, so that's your residual flows that are sometimes attached to consents. They are determined through the consent process rather than being set in the plan, and some parties suggest that they all need to be set in the plan, and they oppose that ability for alternatives to be set during the consent process. And then finally, for flows and take limits, B block flows or supplementary high flow takes. We prescribed a method in the plan which is a little bit complex, and that would be worked out consent by consent. But we had feedback that it would be a lot easier if those supplementary flows and take limits could just be worked out now. They're based on the 7-day mean annual load flow, so worked out now and actually set in the plan. And the technical advice we've had is that for rivers where we've got flow recorders, the information would be reliable enough and probably wouldn't change much over the lifetime of a plan, and so it would be appropriate to set those flows and take limits now in the plan. Moving on to the next slide. Permitted activity rules, had quite a lot of feedback on these rules, largely about the domestic and stock drink or animal drinking water rules, and a concern that the rules are too strict. So that's largely about the amount of water that can be taken as a permitted activity, and concerns about animal welfare were raised there. The other main feedback on the permitted activity rules was requests to include other uses in the permitted activity rules. And for example, there was request to permit taking the water for horticultural rootstock and for biosecurity purposes. Efficiency, something that's come up in meetings before and has been discussed, and the key things there was a request to consider efficiency at a broader scale. So that's consider it at a broader scale than just the farm or consent scale. A concern about unintended consequences if the use of water and conveyance of water becomes more efficient, and the consequences of that. And then lastly, concern that efficiency gains will result in insufficient water in dry years. So if someone's coming in for a consent renewal, their amount of water that they get, one of the things that's considered is how much they've used in the past 10 years. And so understandably, there's a concern that the more efficient they are and the less water they use now, the less they'll get in the future. So those are the key things that I wanted to just talk you through in relation to the region-wide provisions. Happy to take questions now or pass over to Sam and take questions when he's finished.
We'll take some questions around those. There's about four sections you covered, I think, Fleur. So
sure.
We'll take some questions on those if we have any questions. Like everybody's happy at this stage. So do we go Sam now?
I think the next slide is yes. I'll hand over to Sam. Thank you.
So we did receive a lot of feedback and some issues that was raised on some of the proposed flows, levels and limits for specific water bodies. So some of the concerns raised related to the Clutha Mata'o main stem and the proposed minimum flow that we put in the plan. A lot of this was sort of internal regulatory feedback, largely around some issues with that condition and how you would actually enforce it. It's quite a complex sort of system, and it includes various inflows of different river catchments, and it also includes a lake level from Hawea. And so yeah, we received feedback around some challenges in how you'd actually enforce that condition on a consent. And so we have been trying to work through some of those issues and tweak some of those issues. However, I think given that we are required to set those flows that apply to the taking of water, we sort of decided that we're not really going to take any change to the approach there, acknowledging some of the limitations, but also the requirement. In effect, as it is proposed, though, it would have a limited effect on existing water users, which is part of the issue with the condition. But yeah, there's sort of no change there. We also received concern from clause 3 parties around the impacts of their proposed minimum lake levels that would apply to some of our controlled lakes. So those are lakes that are largely associated with our hydro dams on Clutha, Mata'o, and some other catchments across the region. And I think the main issue that was raised largely from hydro generators is the way that the condition around a minimum lake level was expressed in the plan. There's a real concern on what that would mean for their operation and their maintenance of really critical regionally and nationally significant infrastructure, and how it actually operates with the purpose of the controlled lake in the first place. So we've sort of really taken that feedback on board and sort of trying to consider how we would adapt that approach. And while we don't want to necessarily change the overall approach to how you set that lake level, in terms of how it applies to the taking of water. We do want to amend that condition and provide for the maintenance and operation of those existing schemes. So make it clear in the plan that whilst that's a restriction on the taking of water, there's a pathway for those existing hydro schemes and infrastructure. And so another water body that received feedback from affected parties was the Waikouiti River. And so, yeah, we received quite a mix of feedback from those affected parties. Some were in support of the proposed minimum flow and take limits that we set. They were quite environmentally conservative as a proposal that we were seeking feedback on. And although some supported that proposal, the consent holders in the catchment certainly expressed some issues with that proposal, given that it was quite conservative and the effects that that would have on their water use and what it would mean for the sort of financial viability of their operation, more in the farming sector, and also for the water supply from Dunedin City Council. So next slide, please, Tom. So given that feedback and some reasons I'll get into, we're actually proposing a change of approach with the Waikouiti River. So rather than the proposed minimum flow that we put out seeking that feedback, we're actually, we think it would be more appropriate to set a take limit based more around the actual use in the catchment, which would be assessed on the methods that we're sort of developing and proposing in the water plan, and also to set a minimum flow that's based on the current settings, which are residual flows. So some of the main reasons why we would be proposing or recommending a change here is that the original proposal, under some further analysis and feedback, we consider is not really that appropriate. It was largely based around the sort of default setting that we're using for all our low use catchments. And so given that there is some modification of the catchment already, we're not considering that that's slightly inappropriate. And so we're making this recommendation largely because the health of the Waikouiti is largely achieving the outcomes that we want. There are a few issues for sure, but a lot of the water quality is in a really good sort of higher bands that we're trying to achieve. And we've sort of sought some further technical advice around the minimum flow itself having limited impact on the health of the estuary. And it's more a case of controlling land use, particularly some of the sediment loss issues that we're having in that catchment. And largely the current settings in the catchment have a limited effect on hydrology. And they largely provide a fairly high level of protection for habitat retention of indigenous fish species and also sports fisheries as well. Catchment. So that's very much a summary on that kind of recommendation there. I'm happy to take any questions or add any further detail. Right.
Andrew, and Brian.
I just want to sort of test my thinking here. So essentially this is just adding a bespoke limit to this one where it was otherwise a default limit. Would that be accurate?
That's accurate, yes.
I'm just wondering if we anticipate sort of with more information coming out about the different uses of all these different catchments and rivers and stuff along the course of the plan after it is notified. If we anticipate wanting to add more bespoke ones, you know, further down the line after the plan is notified. Sorry, a broader question, not on this specific one.
Yeah, so I'll answer that and a long time ago, but Tom and I did speak about the fact that as we develop the plan, we will be able to get more bespoke information. And part of that is getting a framework now to enable us to connect, to collect the monitoring information, etc. to do that. So the intent at some point down the track is for all of the rivers to have appropriate bespoke limits.
Andrew?
Yeah, thanks, Ian. Just with regards to the Waikouaiti scenario, my understanding there's 3 takes, the Stoneburn at the top of the North Branch, and then there's 2 close to the at the bottom end, I suppose. One's Dunedin City and the other one is adjacent landowner. The feedback that you mentioned in your summary, they talked about the proposed changes and limits are unworkable, unrealistic, and unjustified. So I assume, I did read the DCC one. I assume there were unintended consequences that probably would have fallen out of the original proposal. So I suppose I need to ask you, in light of that feedback, unworkable, unrealistic, and unjustified, do you feel, and I know it's not all about existing activity and ensuring that it's sustainable, but it's balancing the environmental needs. So are you confident that the proposed take limit is workable and realistic?
Yeah, I think those are some of the kind of direct words we were actually receiving from the consent holders, because they felt like the original recommendation was going to be particularly challenging for them.
So
the recommended sort of take limit we're setting based around actual use, my feeling would be that that would be workable for existing water users, because it's essentially setting in place what is currently being taken, and that actual use will consider both dry years and wet years, and there's a whole method to determine what the actual use is, so that it is appropriate for the existing water use, whilst also protecting the environment.
Cool. Lord, I had another question, but it was to do with the allocation. I can deal with that. We'll come back to that later.
Yeah, okay, thanks,
Thank you.
Andrew. Yeah. O'Brien?
Cool. So there's been 2 questions. There's been a modification, proposed modification in relation to the Waikouaiti, but not with the Clutha minimum flow. So maybe if you just talk us through the reasons for that in relation to the Clutha, because the previous overhead referred to the Clutha, yeah?
Before we move on to that, have we got any more questions around the Waikouaiti scenario? We'll come back to you, Brian.
Oh, sorry. Mine's on this topic and it includes the Waikouaiti, but seen as out to public workshop as well. A question would be around the ability to increase flows and solve problems to do with water quality, because it seems as though Waikouaiti, but also some other catchments that where we have water quality issues, perhaps partially solved by elevating flows, but not entirely. So yeah, I guess it's just a broad principle of it's not the delusion's the solution, but you know, is there a need through planning to look after water quality in these rivers, which is important, to do more than just raising flows?
And I think that was sort of what the technical advice was getting to, was that there's more work needed, but the quality and quantity work together.
Thanks.
Tom, you going to add?
No, I was just going to say that's part of the review process as well. The current regime, basically what we're doing is the Waikouaiti with water quantity, proposing to continue a regime that's been set by the court. And I think once the plan is put in place and other non-regulatory measures, it's kind of keeping an eye on what's happening and how all these different tools kind of work together, and then do a review afterwards to see whether the combination of freshwater management plans, water quality provisions, and the water quantity regime achieve those outcomes.
Thank you.
Oh, that is a question, sorry.
Can I just get some clarification just for myself? So the 150 and the 350 litres says that that's the existing minimum flows in the current consents. Is that right?
So those current settings
Yeah.
are residual flow conditions on the consents, so they're not a minimum flow that applies to the catchment, but they have the same effect for the consent holder. If they can't maintain that flow, they have to either stop taking or restricting their take.
So those levels, were they, what was behind those numbers? Where those numbers come from?
So that would have been a decision made on the consenting that we're not privy to. So, but there would have been a full assessment when the consents were issued to determine those flows were appropriate.
Yeah, okay, so then there's this, my last one, but so that's basically where they're working now, and we can work on water quality at the same time, but is it built in? Because I think the idea is to go to bespoke limits, like do the study and come up with a for Tom and his team to go through and create a specific limit for the Wakaiti catchment and then in the foreseeable future. Is that what I'm?
Yeah, so this recommendation would make essentially a bespoke limit for the Waikaiti River based on those levels.
This is the bespoke solution. Yeah. As opposed to a default kind of approach.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you, Brian.
Cool. So 2 questions. One was the Clutha. So what there were concerns raised and they weren't taken on board?
So yes, there were concerns raised with the nature of the condition, because it is quite a complex minimum flow that includes several catchments and a level of the lake. And there's a challenge with how you would enforce that. These included like the sites that record the flows. They're not all council sites, some are operated by NIWA because they are part of the Clutha Hydro Scheme operation. There were sort of technical issues just with how it was drafted and how you would actually verify it, sort of get it into like how you would calculate the average of a particular site that we've tried to resolve. I think it's important also to note like the minimum flow and the purpose of it for the Clutha serves quite a different purpose to a minimum flow and all other catchments. It's a current condition that's been finding its way in practice, and it's largely around sustaining the operation of the Clutha Hydro Scheme. It's not set as an environmental threshold to protect aquatic systems.
Okay. Cool. And through the chair, my second question is, it's a general question. There's a lot of complex submissions through this consultation. How does that feed through to the independent panel that's appointed following notification? Is this same technical information sort of parked and they see it, there's been a concern voiced and then they review that, or do they start from the start fresh again and everybody submits and the science and so forth? Yeah, so that's a general Yeah, so for example, the concern on the Clutha, is that sort of that now lost to that process? Or does it feed through for a second hearing?
I think in legal terms, we're starting afresh once notified.
Starting fresh.
Starting afresh. However, there needs to be a record within the Section 32 report that deals with this step of the consultation process. Yeah.
Cool. Thank you very much.
We'll come back to you now, Henry, yeah, your allocation one.
So I think it's a question for Fleur. Just.
She's in an aeroplane, so try me instead.
Oh, sorry.
If that's all right.
Did I misread? Fleur speak before?
I was checking.
Oh, Jackie.
Jackie, oh, sorry.
Oh,
I think I'm Jackie. With regards to phasing out allocation and understand that that's required and understand that new takes where existing over allocation already exists are prohibited, understand that. I'm just trying to, I suppose, understand what provisions are made to take into account existing situations where there's an investment in infrastructure of X, there's an over allocation of X, and taking that over a period of time to reduce that over allocation and understanding what weight is given, if any, to the investment that's already existing, that's occurred over, well, a long period of time. So I'm just trying to understand how that works. Yeah, that's probably my main concern on that topic.
thanks, Andrew. I think Anita's gonna.
Jackie, I might pick this one up and then you can add some detail.
Sure.
The reason without those considerations that happen. And you might recall last week we had a conversation about consent duration and some of the factors that would be considered. So that's exactly why those provisions and that framework is there to enable that consideration to happen. But that has to happen in the context of the policy framework, which requires us to phase that over allocation out. So it will be a factor, absolutely. And that will be balanced against the need to get the allocation down and if a catchment is over allocated.
Sorry, through the chair. So from an objective and a policy perspective, we've got a framework in there that on a case-by-case basis, absolutely accept that. But homes in on the situation where there is considerable investment made, has been made historically, and that's taken into account in particular when the duration, not the duration, the length of period of time that the over allocation has to be reduced. So you understand what I'm saying? Because if it's a short time frame, you'll have people walking off the land. But if it's a time frame that allows, it might be a generation or whatever it might be, but and I just can't remember the dates because they vary from FMU to FMU. But it's something that I think is quite a mixed and challenging situation to be put in. If I'm trying to put my feet in the shoes of people that will be confronted with these situations. So that's why I'm asking the question.
Sure, and if the bank asked me to pay my mortgage back tomorrow, I wouldn't be able to do it. So I absolutely understand the point you're coming to. So the visions will guide some of that, absolutely, but there has to also be a pragmatic on what I'm not aware of, and Tom will be better to speak to this, is what other objectives and policies. So it's a factor in the consideration, just not sure about the others, so I'll just throw it to Tom.
I've got to dig in my memory. Jackie, do you have a ready answer for that?
Sorry, some of what Anita said cut out, but I think she covered most of it. But are you asking what other objectives and policies are there to provide for that sort of consideration? Is that the question? Yeah. And again, Sam looked at some of the dates and things. I think Anita's already covered. This is exactly why phasing is needed and why we had to look at different catchments and try and be quite specific about when we thought we might need to phase out over allocation, keeping in mind the timeframes to achieve the long-term visions as well. There's no specific policies that require consideration of investment and infrastructure, if that's what the question is. The only other flexibility, I guess, in the policies is that there's kind of a two-pronged approach where there's the ability for users to come up with their own way to reduce over-allocation in a catchment, which doesn't directly address what you're raising, but does provide them perhaps with some flexibility to reduce over-allocation in a different way. Still the same time frame, still got to reduce down below a limit, but perhaps some flexibility to do it their way rather than just having some sort of proportionate reduction that's equal across consent holders. But Sam, I don't know if I've missed anything there that you want to add?
All I could add to that would be like, we have tried to factor in those timeframes for the specific catchments, recognising there's that tension between the need to phase it out, environmental improvement, and those issues around what it actually means for people on the ground in terms of investment, timeframes and the likes.
I've just taken a note, we'll go away and just have a look at whether or not there is a policy gap that we could flag within the of the framework. So
There is a
There
policy.
is a policy. So in the land and freshwater chapter that provides the kind of strategic policies, there's a policy that covers over allocation as a concept. So that includes water quantity, but also water quality. And that provides for the recognition of investment of existing uses and providing for the opportunities.
Because through the chair, because I think if I was a bank manager listening to this conversation, I think my ears would prick up around the length of period the transition is targeted for. And we don't want to create unintended consequences. I suppose that is my point. Yeah, I think now's the time to give a bit a bit deeper thought around how that's managed going forward, because it is a real concern out there in the community. So yeah, thank you.
So just to round that out, Mr. Moore has just pointed out there's a provision in section 104. So when you consider consent applications, to consider the value of the investment. So while there's that generic or that policy in relation to land and water, I think we just need to go away and have a look, see if we need a more generic policy that sits across and see how that might work, that gives effect to that direction in the RMA.
Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. Good questions. Do we have any other questions? That was excellent. Thanks. Want to get and work on it. Yeah.
Okay. Shall we move on to the next topic,
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah.
Will be
which is damming?
Damming. Yeah.
And that will be Tim.
Kia ora koutou. Thank you. So in terms of the key feedback on the damming chapter, the draft plan currently encourages off-stream storage of water, but restricts in-stream damming unless it is temporary or renewable energy for protecting or enhancing ecosystems, or where it doesn't have any material effects on water bodies and ecosystems. It also provides for the replacement of existing in-stream dams. This approach largely responds to previous direction from Council and Mana Whenua. And as Tom mentioned earlier, there's strong direction in the MPSFM for avoiding the loss of river extent and values. So we had some feedback from some parties consider that this is too restrictive and should recognise a wider range of damming activities, while others consider it to be too lenient. In terms of taking of water into in-stream dams, the draft plan signals future requirements for large existing in-stream dam owners to measure or model the amount of water stored by their dams and measure the inflows and outflows. This is largely to inform freshwater accounting and respond to direction in the MPS for setting limits on how much water can be dammed in freshwater management units. So some parties were concerned about the potential costs and challenges with this approach. This isn't an easy issue, so staff are investigating ways to achieve the desired outcomes for freshwater accounting. On to the next slide. For dropout rules, so where permitted activity conditions can't be met the activity generally requires a consent as a discretionary activity. So some parties are of the view that this should be more lenient, for example, including restricted discretionary or controlled activity rules. And finally, for diversions, feedback was received seeking more clarity on the diversion rules, including to control their scale, duration, and effects. So staff are working through these rules and updating them to ensure they're clear for plan users. So that's the main points for damming, but happy to take any questions or clarify anything if needed.
Thank you. So you're aware that's over a couple of pages on your notes. Do we have any questions around the damming, the overall damming?
Yes.
Brian?
Sorry, dropout rules. I'm not familiar with dropout rules.
Oh, so sorry, that's if an activity is unable to be met under the permitted activity rule, then it will cascade to the next rule, which could be restricted discretionary, it could be discretionary, etc.
The drafting gate, basically. If you can get through the gate, you're permitted. If not, you go somewhere else.
And that's what dropout means. What? Thank you.
Any other discussions? We don't appear to have any other discussions around these ones, so just from myself, from the taking water into in-stream dams. Sorry, I'm getting confused. I was thinking about non-in-stream, off-stream dams. That's in the next section, I think, is it? No? No. I've got a line down here, you've got staff for investigating options to simplify and streamline in order to achieve the same outcome. I was probably wondering what that means. So I assume like you're going to be bringing water around, like doing, it's all consent based. Is that correct? Would be currently now?
Yep.
So is there any major differences compared to what it is currently now?
Tim, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that staff are investigating alternative ways refers to the way of trying to get a better understanding of how much water is actually captured by dams over time. A dam volume, the volume of a dam doesn't necessarily equate how much water is being captured over time. It's quite complex because you get inflows from different sides as well as runoff. So we're trying to look at ways of gathering that information, which we need, without causing too much burden for consent holders. Is that correct, Tim?
Yes, yeah, that's correct.
It's one of the things that we struggle with, for example, with the Manaharakia, is how much water is actually being captured by the dam. So we really want to set us up for the future and being able to kind of have a better understanding of that in other situations as well, or prevent those types of situations happening in the future if we get a proposal for a new dam.
Well, thank you. We can continue on.
Okay, and the last topic is basically revolves around feedback that we got around the provisions that are captured or that are included in the FMU and ROHE chapters. We didn't get a lot of feedback on that because the chapters are actually relatively small when you look at the other chapters in the plan with region-wide provisions. The first one was around environmental outcomes and objectives. Generally, there's support for those environmental outcomes, but some parties have requested amendments to them. Amendments in the sense that some asked for those outcomes to be reworded. Others asked for new outcomes to be stated for specific FMUs. Our general approach with this is that we're actually not proposing to do any changes at this point. The reason for that being, one, we've consulted a lot on the outcomes. We actually, two of the three consultation stages sought outcome on the environmental, sought feedback on the environmental outcomes. And generally, we got good support for that. The other reason is that the environmental outcomes are actually built around values that are described in the NPSFM. And I think that gives us an advantage because there's clarity around what we mean with a certain value as well. What we will, however, do is once the RPS gets approved, we need to kind of do a review of all the outcomes and see whether they align with the visions in the RPS. So we have to do it, and then we'll think about it again. It's a short answer to that question. A second subtopic where people kind of expressed some concerns around was around the policies in the North Otago FMU chapter. And what it means is basically a few parties expressed concern about the policies that require us to consider the Waitaki allocation plan and also to have a Kūtakitai approach applied to any decision making that involves the Waitaki River or tributaries of the Waitaki River over which Otago has jurisdiction. Again, we're not proposing to make any changes there. What we're doing basically here is we're not changing the goalposts. We're basically carrying over a regime that's already in the current plan as well. There is, however, a review of the Waitaki allocation plan on the horizon. And it might be better to kind of wait until then to kind of review that. But in the meantime, as an interim regime, carry over the current policies. That's basically our advice there. We also had some feedback on FMU specific rules, proposing the activity status for dairy, and also some feedback on the setbacks for cultivation. We covered this off last week with primary production, so I wasn't planning on going into those right now, but I thought it would be good to kind of note that those comments were made at the FMU chapter level. We received some limits around, some requests around putting in limits around groundwater. Now we are setting water quantity limits for groundwater, but we are not setting water quality limits for groundwater. Firstly, the NPSFM is actually very limited in terms of how it deals with groundwater. It doesn't set bottom lines for groundwater. Secondly, we ourselves are kind of limited by the amount of information that we have currently. Our groundwater monitoring network is expanding, but we're dealing with a legacy issue that it was previously quite small. So we don't have a lot of robust data to actually set groundwater quality limits in the plan right now. There is, however, I think in the LTP, it's a plan change planned in the coming years for groundwater. So to fill that kind of gap, so to speak, in the plan. And then finally, we did get feedback on the target attribute states and the alternative criteria. Alternative criteria are ways of basically measuring outcomes when you don't have attributes in your plan. We've got some support for that, but we also received some feedback that the target attribute states are too low in certain circumstances. Some asked for target attribute states for more locations. for more values and for more water body types like wetlands. In the case of the latter, it's really hard to set target attribute states for wetlands because they're kind of a different type of water body. And again, we have very limited water quality data to base ourselves on. Then some parties have said there is a disconnect between values and target attribute states or alternative criteria. And basically what they mean is values have different aspects, and we should make sure that we set target attribute states that provide for different characteristics of different values. A good example would be human contact recreation, like the target attribute states. They make sure that the water quality is good in those recreation spots. But a very valid concern has been put to us that, well, there's also a quantity aspect on recreation. We don't set target attribute states for that, and we're not planning to do that. But we do consider recreational values when we look at minimum flow setting and allocation setting as well. And then finally, some have requested for more monitoring sites, which I think the science team is doing a great job at, is constantly expanding that monitoring network. That's in a nutshell the feedback that or like the general themes that come through and the feedback on the FMU specific provisions. Happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Tom.
I'm just wondering around those, so mentioned in the paper or the table talks about how some of those target attribute states, the setting of is constrained because of the monitoring data. Do we have enough long-term monitoring sites out there now for that data to come in, and it's just a matter of waiting for it, or is there more work that we need there?
So it's a bit variable. One of the things that we've got planned for the next financial year, so year one of the next LTP, is a network monitoring review, just to undertake that analysis and check. There are some new attributes that we haven't been monitoring that are just getting picked up. We have some monitoring sites and parameters that we've been monitoring for a really long time. So it is quite variable, but we are developing the program to fill those gaps and just to assess that we are in the right spot for the right thing.
Thank you. Brian.
Cool. Thanks, Tom. Others. How do you reconcile the disconnect between GMP and achieving the TAS?
How do we reconcile the disconnect between the target attribute states and basically the framework for managing water quality in the water plan?
Yeah, so what we've been really clear about for quite some time is that the plan will send us in the right direction, but at this stage it won't get us to achieve the vision, and we were always clear that there would need to be more changes over time. So what the science modelling, and its modelling tells us is that we may achieve movements within bands, but we won't achieve movements up bands. And this plan is 10 years, and the visions in most cases are longer than that, so that's okay. We're allowed to take the time that we need to get there, and reflecting on Councillor Moon's point earlier that these things need to take time, and that's one of our biggest levers that we have, is enabling that time to get where we need to go.
Yeah, but nevertheless, the target attribute states are expected to be achieved within those vision timelines, yeah?
As it currently stands in the MPS, yes.
Correct. Thank you.
Anita, can I ask a question that may not be completely in scope, but is the ability going forward or within the plan around what Brian's saying is to have more targeted attribute states, have them targeted beyond just at FMU level to a more to a catchment level?
We could choose to monitor additional requirements, but we are still required to monitor what's in the MPS. We could add to that rather than take away.
Andrew?
Just going back to the targeted attribute states, just remind me what the baseline, when the baseline was identified, how recent was that in terms of developing the actual the TAS? Because my understanding is, Tom's just left the room. Other Tom, sorry.
You left a while
I
ago.
think it's
Well, I'm back.
important to understand, just because making that point around targeted attribute states, and it's probably useful to understand. Sorry, I won't till he comes in. Sorry, Tom. Hope you went on the way to the lavatory. Sorry. Hey, just going back to the targeted attribute states and the baseline that drives the identification of what we're trying to achieve. Are you just able to remind me about how recent that baseline, what are we talking the baseline in more recent years or in more latter years?
So how you set baseline is quite prescriptive within the MPS setting. So it asks you to do a number of things. We've tried to take we see that as quite a overly rigid way to set baseline. So we've outlined a more pragmatic approach to doing that. So you're supposed to set baseline by taking your 5-year average of your water quality data at a point in time, which is a very specific date in 2017, maybe the 27th of August or September or something like that. If you calculate that value, you then end up with a letter for each site. But if we then do a rolling average of that 5-year, year on year, afterwards, you'll see that move up and down quite a lot. And so, if you are required to develop a management plan for change within the catchment or anything like that, after setting baseline based on that first principle, well, actually, there's quite a few sites that have ranged from, had a baseline of, say, C, but ranged from, on that 5-year rolling average year on year, have ranged from A to D. So have dropped into D for a specific year and then have been B or A the year afterwards. So they do bounce around quite a lot, especially where we've got a number of different practices going on. So setting that baseline, we've had to be quite clever about. So we've looked at those sites where that rolling average bounces around quite a bit, and have tried to take a pragmatic view by looking at how that site has varied over time and all of that sort of stuff. But we've set baselines based on a value that appears to be where we're at the present point in time, taking into account that variability if it does exist. So some sites are set up based on that 2017 value. Some where a pragmatic approach is required, we've looked at those averages and developed something that's a bit more nuanced.
Thank you.
Can I just quickly follow up on that? So you said we take a baseline of the 2017 value, so that'll be the 5 years prior to 2017?
That's correct, yeah.
And can you just say again, so in some cases, if you don't have sufficient information, you've determined you
where the data has been, so we do have sufficient information, but where the data tells us that site, for instance, if your baseline on that 2017 date was a B, but you've had for the 4 years prior were a C or a D, and a few years after that date have also been a C or a D, we've taken a pragmatic decision that actually the 5-year average in the lead up to that, to 2017, is not a fair representation of where that site's at in the longer term. and have provided a judgment on what a more appropriate baseline might be.
Thank you. Do you have any other questions? Thanks, Tom.
It's just a general question. We've gone through clause 3 feedback, but we haven't included forestry for the reasons we understand. So just in terms of the time frame for going through the forestry clause 3 feedback, when will that be?
So the plan is, following the discussion this afternoon, to present a program based on whatever decision council reaches today. We are expecting to receive the feedback from forestry imminently. And then we'll make sure that we program in, obviously the assessment of that by staff, any recommendations arising from that, and a conversation with council. The exact time will depend on the conversation this afternoon and the decision reached on the program.
Thank you.
Andrew?
On that same topic, there were a number of councillors that fed into the process, not as clause 3, but during that period. And also at our last clause 3 workshop, I did ask a question about the internal feedback, if that could be circulated. So I just wondered on both those topics, when you hear back in some way, shape or form about the councillor comments.
Yeah, so and that's on me, apologies. The team have had responses drafted to councillor feedback, and that will come back today. And we will also circulate the internal feedback later on this week, which is today or tomorrow.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. Do we have any other questions or comments? Have any online? Do we have any questions online? All good. Karen, welcome, Karen.
Yeah, Mike's involved.
So, I think welcome, Edward. Other than that, thank you all very much for having your input, and we'll just close the workshop with a karakia. Aio ki te ara, ki te rangi, aio ki te whenua, aio ki ngā tangata katoa. Pihei Māori ora, peace to the sky, peace to the land, peace to everything. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.